Hello, and welcome to a session of the Abolition Open School. Um, my name is S.A. Smythe. I work at UCLA. I'm a poet, translator, and scholar of Black life and study. I am joined here with co-moderator Alejandro Villalpando, who is a professor and abolitionist in Pan-African Studies, the Department of Pan-African Studies at CSU LA. Um, so certainly we are in this virtual space, but I'm going to take an attempt at land acknowledgement from CSU and UCLA, not least because that's where Alex and I are based. So CSU and UCLA are located on the homelands of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, who in the face of ongoing settler colonialism continue to claim their pace as and act as stewards of their Tovangar or ancestral lands. Additionally, the greater Los Angeles area is home to some of the largest indigenous populations in the US. It's the ancestral homeland of the Tongva, the Ahotcheben, the Chumash, the Tatavia, the Cahuilla Nations, the Chemehuevi, the Pipa Ahamakav, the Morongo, the Pachanga, the Soboba, among many, many other peoples. It's presently home to large communities of indigenous peoples from the Greater Turtle Island, the Pacific Islands, Africa and Latin America, including Zapotec and Mixtec peoples. Ultimately, no matter where we are in physical space as we fellowship in virtual space, the project of abolition requires us to bring our attention to sustained and improvisational modes of liberation, freedom dreaming, and solidarity, practiced in concert across various regions of the globe in ways past, present, emerging, and always deeply interrelated. I'm going to, since we're introducing this Abolition Open School, I want to give out our mission statement. The Abolition Open School is a COPS off-campus collabo between abolitionist groups working across the California State University and University of California systems who seek to build shared knowledge of abolitionist principles with our communities. What we're trying to do is a year-long series of conversations, debate, interviews with activists, artists, scholars, and others impacted by the carceral state, by colonialism and racial capitalism. Collectively, we want to explore the history, necessity, and shared horizon of abolition in an accessible way for those both familiar with and new to abolitionist strategies and practices. This session of the Abolition Open School is a part of a Freedom Course series of the American Studies Association. End of sentence. Special shout out there to Dylan Rodriguez, who's ASA president this year, and to ASA grad assistant Yvonne Bramble. Shout out also to Nigel Whitson from UCR, Blackness Unbound, and many other things. And to the co-organizers of this session, Alejandro Villalpando, Alex, who's co-moderating with me, Melissa Maseko from CSU Long Beach, and Shannon Robach from CSU Dominguez Hills. I'm going to, I feel like I'm already talking so much, but I'm going to quickly get out of the way. I'm going to now just give a run through and introduce folks in the order I have here. First, Beyond Prisons. Beyond Prisons is a podcast that explores incarceration from an abolitionist perspective. The show amplifies the voices of people directly impacted by the system and seeks to tell stories that push us to imagine and work towards a world without prisons. Launched in 2017 by Kim Wilson and Brian Sonenstein, Beyond Prisons is an educational and political resource for those new to abolition and those long engaged in movement work. Kim, you can wave, Kim, is our co-host and produces Beyond Prisons podcast. She's an artist and educator, the mother of 3 adult children, a daughter and 2 sons. Both of her sons are currently sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brian is an independent journalist and editor. He's one of the founders of Shatterproof, a press organization driven to expose systemic abuses of power in business and government while developing a model for independent journalism, which supports a diverse range of young freelance writers and contributors, Brian is the other co-host of Beyond Prisons. Then we have Khadijah Abdurahman, who is a child welfare system abolitionist and an independent researcher whose focus is predictive analytics in the child welfare system. Khadijah is the co-founder of Word2RI, an oral history archive of racial justice and gentrification on Roosevelt Island, and director of We Be Imagining, a series of digital programming examining race and technology through infusing academic discourse with the performance arts and in partnership with community-based orgs in collaboration with Columbia University's Insight Center and the American Assembly's Democracy and Trust program. Last but not least, we have Hamid Khan, who's an organizer with the StopLAPD Spying Coalition. The mission of, and I'm gonna slip in UCLA cops off campus, but we'll talk about it. The mission of the coalition, StopLAPD Spying, is to build community-based power to dismantle police surveillance, spying, and infiltration programs. The coalition utilizes multiple campaigns to advance an innovative organizing model that is LA-based, but has implications regionally, nationally, and internationally. So these are our esteemed panelists. I've spoken so much. I wonder if we can just take it up in that order that you were introduced and talk to us a little bit deeper than the bios that I just read out about the orgs that you're repping and how you came to this work.
Sure. Kim, did you want to kick this off? You want me to take it?
You can go ahead. Cool. You know how we do this on the podcast, so.
I remember how we met, fortunately, so I can start there. At least from my perspective, I came at this from both an organizing and an independent journalism background, sort of the citizen journalist route rather than the institutional route. And, you know, I had been following around 2015 to 2017, a lot of the prison uprisings that were happening around the country and reporting on them. And when the Vaughn uprising happened in Delaware, where Kim's two sons are incarcerated, she was somebody who I reached out to and who we connected with to try to tell the stories that weren't being told through the media. You know, much like a lot of the mainstream press, the Delaware press was basically just publishing propaganda from corrections departments and telling sort of the police point of view. There was almost no voice from any family members or anybody who was actually impacted by incarceration, let alone the uprisings that were going on. There was a lot of heavy control of information. And so Kim and I connected, and I think we had a very long interview. And afterwards just kind of got to talking, and we're like, you know, we should keep doing this, you know, we should keep staying in conversation, and mentioned that, you know, each of us had sort of been thinking about doing some kind of a podcast or some kind of, you know, some sort of media package, and then just sort of took it from there very organically, and just started recording basically like our phone calls with each other to a certain degree. So I don't know, Kim, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been tweeting, and that's how we, you know, connected. I've been tweeting about my experience with, you know, as the mother of incarcerated children, adult incarcerated children, and for a long time. So when the uprising happened, when the rebellion happened, I took to Twitter and, you know, was just trying to counter a lot of the misinformation that was circulating in the media at that time, or just the complete neglect of the story in certain outlets. And that's how I remember us, you know, initially connecting. I'd gotten a bunch of media requests around the same time, and ignored them all, and, you know, put out something on Twitter that basically said I wasn't going to be talking to the media. I'd said what I needed to say. It was, you know, out there, and I stood by that. And Brian sent me an email, and it was probably the only email that I read from media that was just, you know, and I ignored it for about a week. And then, you know, followed up with him after I checked him out very thoroughly, and was, you know, was digging what he was doing, the kind of work that he was doing, and felt that he was, on the up and up, that his work was legit. And I felt comfortable talking to him and engaging with him at that point. And yeah, he told the story, pretty much as it happened. We spent hours talking. It wasn't a regular interview. It wasn't a regular media interview. And I feel like in that moment, it was clear that we were friends. And we just, continued to build from there. So yeah, that's the Beyond Prison's origin story. I come to the work from maybe 20 years ago. And I didn't start off as an abolitionist. I think as a lot of people, they, might come at this from a reform perspective and things like that. I was in a very kind of traditionally conservative field of, public policy, and doing my work, my doctoral work in that area. And was initially interested in voting rights for incarcerated people. And through that work, through my academic work, as well as my other organizing work, really became dissatisfied with the kinds of questions that were being asked in the academy by academics, in the work, and at least in my discipline, and started asking a different set of questions. And started reaching out to different people, different groups and things like that, and really going through a process of unlearning a lot of the things that I'd been taught to think about prisons, to think about prisoners. And let me just say this to be clear. At that point, my sons were not in prison. At that point, my sons were still very, very young. They had not had that experience with, being incarcerated. That comes along a little bit later. So, I started with an interest of just seeing that there were things going on that were not being explained very well by folks in my discipline, and that didn't sit well with me. And then fast forward, a lot of the work that I began to do and the people that I began to connect with showed me a whole different world. Really, really opened my eyes. And the process to becoming an abolition wasn't, or an abolitionist wasn't overnight. It was something that, took some time. And I'm deeply grateful for all of the people that taught me, what this work was, what it was about. And, yeah, I'm not sure how I would survive having two sons in prison and all of the trauma that, incarceration has really piled on my family. If I weren't in this space and surrounded by people that really show up. So, yeah.
Should I jump in? Okay, great. So one is that I'll just start with a little bit of emotional vulnerability here. And if I have a lot of Zoom anxiety. So I printed out some bullet points here that I wanted to share with you guys. One, the question of where did I start or where did this inspiration begin is interesting, just thinking about oral histories, which was one of the original professional things I started on. And I guess for me, when I was 12, I went to a residential behavioral modification center in which the majority of children under the age of 13 were in DCFS, which was the District and Child Family Services in that state, which was Connecticut. And the majority of the children that were from ages 13 to 21, and it went from ages 4 to 21, were international adoptees who had been adopted by white middle-class parents largely, who thought that they were physically unable to have a child, and then later went on to and decided that their child had a certain set of pathologies or behaviors that they were unable to handle and placed them in this institution. And one of the things that I think has really influenced my life is that something that was contraband was reading and writing. And I was really intellectually curious, and there were people who snuck me in books, told me about slam poetry. And despite these limitations on accessing knowledge, there were these relationships that facilitated my access. So I think that's like one chunk of things. And then two, I was really excited when SA invited me to this talk, because one, it's always a good time to talk about abolition. And, one of the things, because this is mediated over Zoom, is that I'm able to connect with people who might not be geographically in the same place, but also in thinking about child welfare. And, I believe in abolish it all. It's not just about child welfare abolition, but I think that in terms of the grassroots movement, and I really am grateful for a lot of Black studies scholars who within slavery are saying that we need a more gendered understanding of enslavement. And this is not just a history of what happened to Black men in their prime on land. We have to think about what happens in the ocean, what happens in the water, about the women and the children and the disabled, and how that was even the choices of who was brought onto them, that process through which they were enslaved and held captive, all of those things are entangled and connected. And so a big thing for me is why did I start getting involved with child welfare abolition, was because they try to snatch up my kids. And then later on, I was able in retrospect to connect it to this early childhood experience. And then I was like, hey, look, they snatching up people's kids. And I really didn't have a megaphone. And then I was like, well, like, how can I get a platform? And so most of the things that I have done have just been a product of how to get a platform. But then I wanted to share 3 points, 2 short stories. They're like 20 seconds, bear with me. One is that I really believe in slow scholarship, which is kind of challenging in the context of the level of urgency that I feel in this moment. But one of the examples I wanted to give is that, so I'm biracial. My father is Ethiopian from the Oromo ethnic group, and my mother's ostensibly white, like Irish. But my kids are non-biracial, and I was learning how to do my daughter's hair, and I have terrible fine motor skills, and I have very minimal patience and ADD, right? And so I was complaining to their auntie, Monique. I was like, it takes so long to put it in, takes so long to take it out. And thank you. And I was just like, this is so tedious. And she showed me this painting of a grandmother doing the mother's hair and the mother doing her daughter's hair. And it just was this moment of recognition that this thing that I find frustrating, even though I don't want them out there looking crazy, right, is really this like generational storytelling and passing down knowledge. And it's, one, for them to look fresh. And we could think about like, what are the reasons why people who are Black in America feel the need to look so clean cut all the time, right? That we don't even have the privilege to come out here looking dusty with socks and chancletas and all that, right? But the other part of it is not only have we passed down like, maps of fugitivity and how to escape, but that process is the mechanism by which we can pass down information and stories. The second story I have is just confession that, it causes cancer and everything. But when I was 12, I started smoking cigarettes, right? And I don't know, this is probably a very like urban centric story, but in New York, we have a lot of corner stores. And when I go into the corner store, if I want to buy a single cigarette, we call it a Lucy. And I say, yo, can I get a Lucy? And the point is there that a lot of times in academia, you can hear all these like suffix branded words and all these complicated concepts, and it could feel like it's another language. And some of that is because people have no idea what they're talking about. And they're worried that if they deviate from whatever's on trend to cite, that you might realize that. But the other part of it is just in-group, out-group behavior, right? So nobody's passing around like some white paper to tell the dude in the corner store how they know that you're not a cop. There's all these like nonverbal contextual signals. If I go in there, it doesn't matter. Even if they know me, if I'm like, can I please purchase an individual cigarette? They're gonna be, I don't know English, or like, we don't got none. I'm so sorry, you tried over there somewhere, right? And that's all to say that there's a whole bunch of different aspects to abolition. And I'm really with these academics with all these big words and these dense books. And it can feel intimidating, but it is just a question of also just in-group, out-group behavior. And we have that within our own communities and our own neighborhoods and our own families. So that's the two. The last thing that I wanted to say is that, so my big things are child welfare and how to abolish this in this continuum of policing. So it's not just the cops on campus, but how are these institutions engines of settler colonialism within themselves? And what does it mean to even use the language of the settler and to use the language of empire to try to dismantle these things, to think about Black children having the highest rate of expulsion and detention and suspension? There's a huge carceral continuum, and we have to reckon with why we just focus on rates of arrest and some people in cages, but not the full span of what cages could look like and who's implementing them and how. And then the second part is thinking about this relational information science system. And what I mean when I say that is that for a long time, I was just observing, okay, you have the rise of commercial search, Google, right? You have these huge content, industrial content moderation and management platforms. And that corresponded with the decline in libraries and curation. And so I think a big thing with tech is I feel like people, especially in grassroots movements, are peripherally aware that, you know, there's like surveillance and privacy implications, but also thinking about how this late stage of capitalism was reconstituting, reorganizing ways in which labor was being produced, and the way that it has deprioritized gendered ways of care work that have to do with mediating that information. And so if you're like me and your child is not a cisgendered, able-bodied, white, middle-class male, you have to do a lot of work to find books that look like them. And then you also have to, like, you know, teach them how to read. You have to do this practice of reading and reading and reading. And so it's just thinking about that care work on a larger scale. And again, just right now, Ethiopia is really big on my mind, and it's been really hurtful to see the level of mis and disinformation being perpetuated on this platform. And like, what does that mean when, one, so many people are just accessing the internet through Facebook due to like international communication telecom schemes, right? Where Facebook might actually be the internet, or in Myanmar, where the word for being online is the same thing as being active on Facebook. What does it mean that Facebook didn't even open an office until 2015? And they got one office for a continent. What does that mean? And then the very last thing that I want to say, and I'm sorry that I'm talking so long, is that scrolling to the core challenges of the series, what does this all have to do with abolition? In the very immediate, I think the left has to reckon with the fact that we're all on Zoom. You know, like, it doesn't matter where you are in the political spectrum, but we're all here hyper reliant on this enterprise video teleconference software. And again, I think people are peripherally aware of the privacy issues, maybe, you know, on the best side, but until the Layla Khalid, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing their name, situation, the Palestinian artist and activist who Zoom decided was no longer legitimate and abandoned the event. I don't think that people really realize the implications of public technology, or the lack thereof. In the beginning of the internet, there was Sun Ra inspired Afro-feminists, Afro-futurists, self-identified freaks and punks that fought for this open space on the internet. And largely they've lost. And so I think when we're thinking about abolition, we're thinking about tearing stuff down, breaking open the cages, getting our people free, thinking about when we say people, who are we leaving out, and, you know, not having this murderous inclusion, to steal from the event that I saw SA at yesterday. But I think that it's also about building stuff up at that same time, in that same moment. And so I really think that this is a moment that the left has to reckon with the way in which we have abandoned kind of fighting for this public space online, and the ways in which we're connecting. What are the particular affordances of these technical platforms, and how can we better capitalize on that? And let me see. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say. Thank you. And I'm really grateful. I'm really excited to talk to all of you.
I didn't check in with the collective about my ability to use reggae air horn sounds, but they're implied. So Alex knows like there's not a call where I don't try to shove those in there. Hamid, please come through.
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, and thank you just being a part of this conversation, much a timely conversation, but an ongoing conversation, and almost a multi-generational conversation. That we've been just on a personal level. So I have been living in LA for just over 40 years. I was born in Pakistan, grew up in Pakistan, my formal education, a BA from Pakistan, didn't go to school here. I've been organizing in LA for about 35 years, first in a more sort of an identity-based politics around the South Asian community. Helped found the South Asian Network, was there for about 20 years, and also engaged in the LA Taxi Workers Alliance, working with the taxi workers. And then in 2010, transitioned into what is now the StopLAPD Spying Coalition. And the primary focus at the time was, and throughout this whole history of, as to just this recognition of my own otherness, in this white supremacist system, immediately then like how that otherness is being what is the white gaze that is being dropped on the otherness, and how you are being measured, how you're being seen, how you're being criminalized, how you're being stalked, how you're being traced, how you're being tracked, and if looks can do whatever, from kill to embrace and everything in between, you sort of that experience informs a whole lot. And then, of course, one's own journey through learning that the history of the United States and the history of enslavement and genocide and settler colonialism and everything else that folks have already talked about. In my own history as well, growing up in Pakistan, and a very classic sort of a comparative to how we see, just a young Black and brown folks going into the military, going into other, state agencies as well, because that's the only route, that's the only survival that had. So drawing those parallels, but similarly growing up in a family where people were also working for the state, were in the police department, were serving in the military and everything else. So helped understand earlier on that, in a sense, that as, coming of age, and it's interesting, Khadijah mentioned age 12, and it was this whole going back, and just yesterday I was thinking about age 12, 13, it was extremely hot growing up in Lahore in the summertime, 112 degrees, 107 degrees at night, laying out. And I think my first sort of a venture into abolition was questioning the faith that I grew up in, questioning monotheism, questioning the domination and the dominance and the complete submission to power. And I think that was the first sort of walking into, and that sort of moves my journey, that it wasn't through a structural sense, but it was like this constant presence of policing of your life, where that which you didn't even know what that carceral state would look like, if you will, to put it in that term. Either you're going to burn in hell or you're going to go to heaven. And you're like, man, this is messed up. I was going to use the F-bomb, but this is super fucked up. So, started so that was my entry into how is this journey going to look like, and how do you shed this load? How do you shed this overwhelming sense of being, where you have no idea? And of course, you're very young and you're being told, on the left shoulder are the good angels and on the right shoulder are the bad, and they are documenting everything that you're doing, which will be presented on Judgment Day. So you're like, this is really twisted. So, so in a sense, for me, it kind of set the tone in a very early age of my life, where I was really measuring dominance and control and proximity to power through that whole understanding of faith, and through that whole, practice of faith and tradition. Of course, growing up, where mother was extremely sort of traditional Muslim woman, and my dad was in his own world himself, and being the youngest of 6 siblings, even in your day-to-day routine, you start looking at hierarchies. You start looking at that. Where does the older sibling sit, and where are you on that food chain? Where if there's going to be only 1 banana a week, how does the older one slap and take half your banana away? So I think, in a sense, these are, now thinking back, these are sort of like moments in time, but they sort of inform you and really start understanding that the whole sort of concept, when we talk about that, what power means and what submission means. So in a sense, I think for me, it's really been that whole journey, and lifting Kim's comment about unlearning, that you realize that that you're living a fractured existence, because it's almost like what's there is messed up. What is not there becomes an illusion, and almost like what is not there that you dream of, that you strive for. So then in a sense, that which helps in charting a path, that how do you then navigate through this fractured existence, and then try to move beyond, but recognizing the realities of what is one part of that fractured existence. So as others have said, the structures are there. You're constantly this whole notion of movement building, but then this whole thing is thrown at you about nonviolent civil disobedience, and you're like, what the heck does that mean? Because communities, we have never been violent, so why the heck are we being lectured about nonviolent civil disobedience? Because it is what we are fighting against is violent. So what is that? So all of these things sort of like just compile and come at you in a sense. And then, when you get into the conversations around abolition, there's always this sanitizing aspect to it that, no, just talk about we're building the alternatives. Of course, we're always, survival is an alternative. And as an immigrant and growing up in families, this whole romanticization and sensationalizing alternatives to this thing, well, just basic survival, as an immigrant, as an undocumented person, as this thing. Similarly, how histories of enslavement and genocide, how people have survived through their own. So in a sense, like, we are living an alternative. So let's build on that, right? Why are we always thinking way out there? So where does that power lie? But also to be very clear that, no, this is not going to be sanitized because things have to be destroyed. It is, so we use these terms about abolition, dismantlement, alternatives, and all of that thing. No, let's be very clear that these are places of extreme harm. These are places of where dehumanization is there's a methodology to that dehumanization, which are thought of, which are legislated, which are justified, which are financed, which are structured, and then they're unleashed in a methodical way. Whether it's done through the smart bombs, or whether it's done through smart cities, or whether it's done through various other things, these things need to be destroyed. So, I think so in a sense, I'll stop there. There are other thoughts too, but to really kind of just have a very honest conversation about abolition, where we're not kind of just dancing around the edges of sanitizing the conversation, and be very real about it, that, what kind of journey are we on? So thank you.
Sorry, just one time. I just really had to. Okay, it's out of my system though.
Well, then I'll play. I'll play some Punjabi Tool if you want. So
that, like, no. It's amazing. That is it. That is. I really love everything y'all have brought, and that is brilliant. But can we maybe pick up? Can we just talk about it from what Hamid? Because Hamid also did like a pretty good job of bringing in Kim and Brian and Khadijah in terms of the relationship between, because y'all took up platforms, you took up different kinds of media to get your voice and the voice of your people heard. How do you, like, what are some struggles, or how do you navigate doing that work, with Hamid talking about the sort of sanitizing tendency of abolition, and what Khadijah was talking about in terms of like the different dialects or different registers of communicating? Do you know what I mean? Like, some people hear abolition and they say, like, here's a sheet of like philosophy and text, or some people say, here's what we do in my community or in the streets. Some people say, here's what we've been doing for generations or ancestrally. How do you communicate that complexity with something like the media?
I think I'd love for Brian to unmute now, because I think we can both, help answer this at least. One question that we constantly ask ourselves is, who are we accountable to? That's something that, we hold at the center of everything that we're doing. And we keep going back to that, right? So we're not trying to outpost people. We're not trying to outpublish anyone. We're not trying to, push out a bunch of episodes, and doing all of the things that that capital wants us to do, right? That we say that we're against, right? So we tend to reproduce the same kinds of, toxic systems and structures in our own lives as we're talking about, doing this project of dismantling and rebuilding. So, one of the things that helps ground our work is to focus on, who are we accountable to? What is it that we're really trying to do, right? If I don't have the capacity because it's been a really crappy week, and my sons have experienced X, Y, and Z, and that's been draining for me, then I just don't have the capacity to record that week, and that's got to be okay, right? And, so in terms of how we come at it, and maybe that's not quite answering the question, but I'm hoping, to kind of build on that and elaborate. to how we get to that point to create that kind of media, because I think the how we make it also matters, right? That, you know, there's a lot of things that we would like to be able to do, but we simply just don't have the capacity to do because we're constrained by, you know, if Brian has to work a full-time job. You know, I have other things, including health issues that I have to contend with. So those things impact the, you know, our capacity to create, right? So then we're very deliberate and we're very clear. And we started off at the beginning, and I think it's a constant figuring out of, you know, the fact that all of this stuff that we're talking about doesn't have an expiration date, unfortunately. Right? Like all of these issues, all of these topics will continue to be relevant, even if, you know, it's trending on Twitter for a day, that topic is still going to be relevant a month away or, you know, 2 months out. So we're not really trying to keep up or, you know, with the news cycle and things like that, which may seem counterintuitive to a lot of folks. But I think that you know, for us, makes this project sustainable, and it makes it something that we can continue to build on and to think about and try to imagine what else we can do. Does that make sense, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would just quickly add to that as well. I think a lot of what you're describing too comes from a desire to not basically want to mimic most of the way that media operates, even on a structural level. You know, if you listen to our podcast, I think for the most part, we have made a pretty strong effort to invite people who are not getting invited everywhere else, to avoid sort of bandwagoning and, you know, no disrespect to academics at all, but to make an effort to not make the podcast, you know, just academics coming on to talk about abolition, talking to people inside and outside of prisons, talking to family members, you know, not trying to get into the whole statistics and tabulation of misery game, and more focus on explaining these concepts and these ideas through the use of storytelling, through the use of vignettes, real life examples, to sort of bring a lot of the things that I think some people you know, might struggle with, that are, you know, that are being referred to here as academic, and to tell through real life stories that people have. So I just wanted to add to what Kim was saying, because I think a big part of it too is like, who are we bringing on to talk about things that are happening in the world? And again, like, obviously abolition is about more than jails and prisons. We spend a lot of time talking about those issues, but also making sure that, you know, we're talking about art, and we're talking about parenting and childhood and things like that. So those are some of the things that Kim's remarks brought to my mind.
Quick,
I just had a few.
Sorry, Khadijah, please feel free to disrespect the Academy and any other white supremacist institution.
Absolutely.
I mean, Alex and I are like, disrespect it. Go ahead.
So I guess, like, I just wanted to share two separate things. One, like a 60-second version of my life story is post Behavior Modification Center, right? I then joined the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was this Marxist Leninist Maoist kind of cult of personality around this dude, Bob Avakian. They're a little out there. I mean, there's like a lot of problems. And one of the reasons I left is that it was so toxic, but it was a good opportunity for me in that I escaped without losing life, limb, or all of my financial resources. And I learned so much about radical politics and grassroots organizing, but I felt very disillusioned from that whole experience, not just specific to the RCP, but just what it meant to organize, you know, during Katrina and the Gina 6 and George Bush and, you know, all of these different factors. And then I had a whole bunch of kids, and I was on welfare, and getting food stamps and going through the shelter system and seeing all my peers getting locked up, and like all the different ways that played out, and having Facebook and seeing what happened to all the people I was in the place with, and watching most of them be the second generation to have their kids snatched up from them, and just feeling very frustrated with that, and turning to books, in part because I didn't have childcare. So I mean, I could be on Twitter and meet the authors of these books. And so Roosevelt Island is this place, it's this really small racist town of one street in the middle of the East River between Manhattan and Queens. And when it literally Main Street, one of the things that happened was that this long-term care facility, the southern half of it was displaced, and they built this graduate technical university, Cornell Tech. And I was just like, my last kid went to preschool, and I was like, I just want to optimize geographically so I could like do some stuff I want close. And that was like 4-minute walk. And so that's how I really started dealing with academics. All to say that, I really, and like the vision from We Be Imagining is like literal, like we be imagining, both this idea of like an active cognition, that like meaning making happens in this moment of encounter, that being is an event, and also we be, because we want it to be some like pro-Black, we have a whole derivative of this verb that doesn't even exist in standard American English stuff, like deal with it, like be all Black on the Columbia website. But also to say that I'm really interested in like, how can we really get people out there, out of here, out of these cages? And when I'm having a conversation with a technologist, I'm not really going to them to be like so down with the dipset and to really truly understand abolition. I'm trying to see, is there a way that I can formulate a consensus enough so they could actually figure out, and I'm sorry, I have an intercom, so they could figure out how to break out these e-carceration ankle bracelets. Like, how can we do this interdisciplinary work? Because the people that I know who are getting their data stolen from the prevention services workers don't really understand predictive analytics, don't necessarily understand what to do about it. But how can we mix and like facilitate an encounter between all of these groups of people? And I was really intrigued by Hamid, I hope I'm saying your name right, what you said about intergenerational, because I think that's a big part of decolonial work. And in this position, I'm 32 years old right now. So from the time I was 17 until now, what I have observed is that artists, academics, and activists have had some kind of like meeting of the mind. There's like activists at residence at different universities. There's some artists at the panel, but the everyday, the welfare, the everyday person who's getting their kids snatched up that, is not going to the Zoom panel, I haven't really seen that come to the fore. And so for me, I'm just trying to figure out with what I got, how do I provide a platform for that? And it's not easy. And I'll just like be honest, like when we were doing in-person events, really good at that. Podcasts, a lot of, white middle-class professionals have great Wi-Fi. And so this is just a real logistic challenge for centering different people's voices. And then you got to schedule, the best recording stuff usually doesn't work on mobile. We did an episode with people in Rikers, and I used this, I can't think of the name, you guys probably know, Brian and Kim, and I recorded them over the phone because they were calling me from their, from the unit. And that took so long to edit. It wasn't clear. They didn't have the high-speed gigabit connection in there. And so that's like a logistic concern, but that's what I'm trying to figure out. How can we get these people together? Because we need more strategy. Like, what happens post panel?
Yeah, that's. I think that's really the Khadijah. That's and it's Hamid. So that's all good. But I think that's really the key, that we are in this universe of digital organizing, and how do we continue building that power? And for the StopLAPD Spine Coalition, this became a major shift, because we were based out of Skid Row. We're guided and informed by Skid Row residents. I don't want to just make this tall claim that our community and my community, because I don't live in Skid Row, but I'm there and kind of been embraced by that community and being honored to be there for the last 10 plus years. But I think, and for us, every Tuesday, we would have a community meeting every Tuesday, like, 4 Tuesdays a month, where the community would be there. And even down to what would that participation look like, that even for us to file for public records, we never consulted lawyers. It would be the community that would engage, because the goal really was that what sort of narratives are we building, and it's about storytelling. and storytelling, like how do we then, in order to fight back, what do we know our fight, and what is the depth of that knowledge about the fight that we have, both on so many different levels, not just about like, because many a times also the claims and the sensationalization and monies. So we haven't even touched the nonprofit industrial complex yet either, that how this whole claim of the most impacted should lead has also been commodified as well. That how people's stories and their trauma gets pimped as well too. And I'm using a harsh word, but that's what we see happen. But then the question really becomes and this is a major fight that we've been having in LA. And I don't never shy away from naming names. Like one of the biggest culprits that we see as a functionary of the state is the ACLU, that we are constantly fighting back. Because laying a claim to represent the community, moving legislation where you don't have a base, you're not even informed, but you're then using that whole thing about, just to let the most impacted lead, but then has that been broken down to the people? Have we really has that conversation been on a ground level that, look, this may be a temporary reform, but in the long run, it's going to circle back as what the structure and the nature of policing is. And it's not only come and get you, but the rest of your family as well. So I think in a sense, the question really becomes that when talking about abolition, that what is in a sense, like having conversations. And I think for me, again, going back to how are people navigating conditions in their lives? How are people have created a community in Skid Row where it is not just like a transient, but it's a community. People are residents of this. So for that to even understand the depth of that claim as to what does it even mean? So how do you then, walking into a community, and so the whole optic changes then. So that helps in understanding, and then through their understanding and recognizing that what is the relevance of policing in our lives, right? I mean, what does it even mean? What is the utility of policing? Because on one hand, it is none. But on the other hand, we are dealing with, right, because police is now being seen more like through the lens of a public utility, that we can't survive without it. It is almost like a service that the state provides, just like water, electricity, roads. So in a sense, so the priorities are as such. Then when it takes that level of significance, and when you look at the city budgets, and there was a whole conversation about defunding policing and the budgets that are going on. I mean, if we were to look at every city's policing budget, it goes to show the priorities of a city, because the budget in this capitalist system reflects the priorities of a city. That what are the priorities? Is it about lifting, and is it investing in youth development, or is it like policing our way out of all of these problems? So in a sense, that comes to play as well. And then the whole notion of this idea between incremental reforms and just saying no. Like at what point do we then kind of just like make those lines very clear that no, this is not acceptable, because incremental reforms, like, while it moves at a glacial pace, it's a huge ship. I mean, all of these metaphors that are used, and you're like, yeah, but people are dying in the meantime as well. So where does the power lie? And then, of course, like, just talking about our own internal struggles within the nonprofit industrial complex. Like who is co-opting what language, who's selling us out? And again, that goes back to this proximity to power, that where are these photo ops, and who's negotiating through the back door, and who's representing whom. So I think this is the kind of, I would say that the mapping that needs to happen, but in a much more deeper level. And I think if and the privilege that we all, at least I don't want to use the word all, but we have as organizers and activists, and being out there, just the access to knowledge, because that gets colonized, so that gets hoarded. So what happens with that? We're looking at the academic complicity, speaking about the academy as well, that how the academy has been on the front lines and creating a roadmap of harm and violence and murder, literally by law enforcement and policing agencies as well. And then also doing like, how are we intersectionally thinking within different structures as well? So I think that becomes important. And maybe just if I can I should just show one or two slides real quickly, SA? Do we have access to screen share?
Now, Hamid, you said my name out loud when you know I'm from the past. But if you are give it a shot. I see that green button there. Try it.
Oh, so it's just said it's been disabled, but it's okay.
You can send it to me. I'm happy to.
Sure, no worries, no worries. No, I just wanted to show this intersectional sort of like, how information moves within various systems, which we call the stalker state. And going back to Khadijah's point about child welfare system, because through that lens, we just released a report on the Department of Children and Family Services in LA County as to kind of like really mapping out the surveillance state within that how the depth of the information. So in a sense, recognizing that, that if we can't, I mean, like when we talk about divest, invest, we got to be very careful that, what we are thinking and where we are going, because the carceral state really runs deep. So, and then lastly, my thing would be as to like, just in a sense, both making it irrelevant, because definitely a very large immigrant community, where are people coming through that? This whole broad stroke claim of people of color, well, what does it mean? Like, what is the depth of anti-Blackness amongst non-white folks as well? What are the challenges that we face? Just today, there was a federal appeals court ruling on the Harvard admission standards, where you have the Asian American community up in arms about like, they're being discriminated against because of affirmative action and all of that. Affirmative action is a different conversation and a different debate. But I think all of these things, we need to very intentionally be mapping out both on a structural and various other levels as well.
Can I ask, sorry, Hamid, I put the PDF, is that the one that you were referencing, the stalker state kind of map?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Hopefully it's I am a Luddite, which connects me to a question that I have before we, I guess, go to questions from the audience and questions you may have of each other if they're hearing each other's stories. We've talked a little bit about how it is difficult to organize in this digital space, and we all know that, even if we are working in media or podcast, radio, etc. I know in Cops Off Campus and the Divest Invest UCLA Faculty Collective and other like local university bound and beyond organizing spaces, it's been difficult to try to organize in the, first of all, disrespectful in its own right space of the academic industrial complex, but with people who are sort of trained into, especially researchers, right, trained into their own scholarship, their own trajectory, to not necessarily think collaboratively, but to think, with propriety, like with a sense of ownership and possession and hoarding knowledge, like Hamid was talking to us about. It's been difficult to sort of break free in what Adrienne Marie Brown, which I love to always bring in, asked us to do, which is move at the speed of trust, right? It's hard to do that when you're looking in two dimensions. And so Kim, Khadijah, and also Hamid, to understand, I'm talking about the intergenerational, like what was required of us, brought in a question I want us to think about, which is the question of not just access in terms of like internet access or like other public resources, but accessibility and the question of organizing in digital space accountably and accessibly in order to sort of move us forward. Is there any concrete thing that you all have learned in the last, I want to say 50 years, but I really just mean 9 months, like since March, in terms of the work that you're already doing, either with the digital platforms or otherwise, how you've had to yourselves adjust? And I know, Kim, you did talk about it with Brian and full-time work, but I mean a little bit in like a concrete sense, like how have you tried to, how have you had to adjust, and how, like what can we learn? We being, I guess, whoever's listening and wherever folks are coming from, but the Abolition Open School, right? Because to be kind of frank and meta, we're trying to put together these sorts of conversations and like divest and shift attention and energy away from the university, even if that's where some of us are situated, institutionalized in a way. How do we sort of keep the sustaining project going if we're never really able to sort of meet one another where we're at in a physical and meaningful sense?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things come to mind in terms of, the podcast, or at least how we've imagined the podcast. And I think Khadijah's point is a really important one in terms of thinking about, the fact that if we're doing work with folks on the inside, them having access is really limited. Right? Them having the ability, we're at the mercy of them being able to call. And then the quality of that call, as you pointed out, like it's just, it's an obstacle, right? And we're not the kind of podcast that wants to be inside of a prison, because we don't want to have to, deal with going through the wardens and prison officials in order to be able to get their permission to to bring that information out. And that's, there are folks who do that, and, that's a different thing, right? And it's not to say that those stories aren't valid. We're just saying that the kind of work that we're doing is very different, that we're trying to really upend and be subversive given what it is that we have, while we're also simultaneously thinking about the limitations of the kind of technology that we're having to use, but also the limitations that folks on the inside and in other spaces are having to deal with, because it's not an easy thing, right? So, this year, at the beginning of the pandemic, we put together, with the help of a lot of other people, a lot of organizers, a guide for incarcerated folks and for their families on how to deal with COVID, right? And it included a lot of things that, may not be obvious to folks, to do in this crisis, which is really unprecedented. And that wasn't going to be, we couldn't just put that out as an episode, right? It had to be something that people could, download and mail to people inside, right? So we had to think about, we have to think about that. In terms of access, I'm also thinking about, or we're thinking about, and tried to get better at doing this, making sure that we have transcripts for all of our episodes. Transcripts take time, they're labor intensive. We have an amazing group of volunteers that has been transcribing our episodes, and that makes it accessible not just for folks out here who may not be able to listen in to the podcast on Spotify or whatever, but also, who may want a physical copy so that they can send it in to someone, right? And we can, break those obstacles or try to collapse those obstacles. Do those things get in? We also have to contend with the fact that, mail is something that's heavily surveilled. The prison knows very well. I mean, I don't know if we should take it as a compliment or not, but, the prison officials where my sons are listen to the podcast. If they're watching now, they should probably sign up on Patreon. You're not getting this for free. But anyway, just saying, so I know that they monitor any mail that I send in much more closely, right, than perhaps someone who is not as public or as visible and outspoken about their life as I am. So I think that I'm looking at it on a number of different levels. This year has been, and Brian, you can chime in here whenever you want. This year has been, I mean, geez, it's been a year. It's been a year that feels like it's been a decade. And the lessons for us, I mean, I would say that we, in terms of output, have put out a lot less this year, in part because our focus has been to attend to the things in our immediate lives, including, people that need care, and dealing with that, in the middle of a global pandemic with all of the other things that are going on. I think that too often our spaces become, about productivity and what, with all the output and all of these things, like that's just not realistic, for me, at least, as an individual, as a person, or if I'm thinking about being part of a group that I can't, I had to tap out for a very long time. And that's because it was really, the weight of everything was really taking a physical and emotional toll on me, and I just couldn't, and that had to be okay. So I had to, and we talk about how are we there for other people? How do we, build community? How are we, supporting each other, right? We talk a lot about mutual aid and what that looks like. And, I can tell you, outside of a handful of people, it just wasn't there, So I think that we also need to address the realities of that there might be a thing that we're thinking that we'd like to do, and then there's the thing that we're doing. And if your experience is different, then that's cool. I'm talking about, what I'm seeing. And it's not just from, just from me or my perspective. I'm talking about from the folks that I'm connected to in terms of who's showing up for them, particularly in this time. So, the podcast has been great. It has, I was just sharing with both Brian and Alex earlier, how yesterday I met one of our listeners who's been an incredible source of support for my oldest son, who's been in the SHU since June 9th of this year. And, and he wasn't doing well. He wasn't doing well, like to the point where I was really, really worried about him. And we put out a call, to ask people to just send cards and letters and what have you. We encouraged people to write to them on a more regular basis if they could. And a few people did. And this goes back to Khadijah's point. I wrote it down here because I wanted to come back to this in terms of care work, that the care work that people are doing, including in our spaces, is left to the women, right? That the people who have been showing up and writing to my sons, yes, there are a few guys that are, writing to them, but it's mostly women. And they're the ones taking out the time to write to them on a weekly basis, to schedule video visits, to put money on their books, to do all of the things, right? And this person is, I don't know if she's online now watching or, what have you. It's like, I told her just how much I deeply appreciate her showing up, because it has made a tremendous difference in my son's life. It has allowed him to shift from feeling completely isolated and alone to one where he feels like, wow, like people actually care, like, and he's had, like people are sending books to him, I send books on a regular basis, but people have been sending him so many books, and he's just been devouring these books. And, he'll call me up really excited. And he's like, did you read, recently he read Sister Outsider. And I'm like, yep, I read it. And he's like, well, what do you mean you read it? How come you didn't give it to me? I tried to send it to you before, you didn't want to read it. So having these other folks come in and show up for him has given him, has opened him up in ways that I could not have done alone, right? So when we talk about the podcast, and, I share that, as an example of something that we didn't even imagine the podcast would be for us. It was just like, we're thinking, oh, we'll put out, we'll get this thing going, maybe some people will listen to us, we'll see what happens. But the response has been tremendous. The response has been incredible. And that act of showing up, because that's what it is, you're showing up for people that are on the inside, people that, aren't connected, people that can't listen to the podcast, people that can't do all of these things. And you're saying, I care about you. Right? Even if you're not saying it in those exact words, that's the message. And I have seen such a shift in his attitude in just the last few months. And it's been a lifesaver. And I don't say that, lightly. It has actually saved his life, because he was not okay before. And so, for us, I don't know, Brian, do you want to add on to that? Because, you have a...
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on about a lot of that. I mean, you and I talk about this stuff fairly often, which I think is a big part of making it work, is kind of being open about it. So I think we're of like mind on a lot of things. I do think that, it is really challenging to sort of both move at the speed of trust, like you said, essay quoting Adrienne Marie Brown, but you know, like Kim was saying, also move at the speed of like our lives. You know, like we do the podcast, but we are not the podcast. And there's been a lot of times when we have something on the calendar and it's like, oh, we should be doing this, and like, oh, you know, like we haven't put out an episode in a while, and you know, Kim and I are kind of always checking each other about like, you know, what good is doing the podcast if like you're putting out 100 fires in the background, and you know, like what matters right now. So I think that that's a huge piece, and I'm glad Kim brought up that part of it, because I think if we had treated making our platform, and this goes for other platforms that I work on too, like Shadowproof, you know, if we treat it like a business instead of like this platform where we're trying to sort of do our best to live out our values in the context of media, then this is the way that we really need to act. And then the only other thing I would add is, and just to underscore, is the issue of accessibility, particularly with people who don't have very easy access to the internet, or very good Wi-Fi connections, like Khadijah was saying. You know, we have, with the help of a lot of volunteers and a lot of people in our community, tried to catch up and produce transcripts. We have people asking all the time for transcripts to print and bring inside. Obviously, like Kim said, there's a big issue as well of like, is that stuff going to get inside? Is somebody going to get in trouble if it's found in their cell? You know, that's sort of one thing that I think has long been a problem, you know, with just zines in general and correspondence in prisons. And I don't know if there's necessarily something, you know, like a silver bullet for that. But it is something that I think about a lot. And, you know, I have always, I mean, I know that like, I think we should make a better effort to marry our digital platforms and the digital media work we're doing with sort of quote unquote old fashioned correspondence and like print work. You know, we have to find a way to bring the digital materials one way or another inside, and make sure that it's getting to people. You know, sometimes Kim and I have talked about sort of, I guess, creative ways about getting information inside that we can, but I think that's really important, especially, you know, for this conversation. I was looking back, I was reading a chapter, one of my favorite chapters out of a book called All Our Trials by Emily Thuma. And she's got a really amazing chapter about printing abolition and about sort of the history of printing zines and all of the different ways that movements and organizations and activist groups have used zines, not just to spread media or like to share news or developments or get out stories, but to connect people on the inside to each other across facilities and across those barriers. I think that is a huge part of it that, you know, something that I think Kim and I should be working on, that we should all be working on, is not forgetting that we're not just talking to people, like we should be helping people talk to each other across these barriers and distances. And I think that is a really crucial part about making sure that the work that we're doing on site is reaching the inside, not just that we're imposing information on them, but how are we bringing in people to talk with us on the outside, but also between each other and build solidarity across institutions and contexts.
One of the things I was really curious about with you guys, and sorry, I don't know if I can answer a question with a question, but one of the things I was really curious is that when you say organizing, what does that mean? And the reason why I asked that is that, just like true confession, when I was doing all this activism stuff within the RCP, you know, I organized a lot of protests and I really hate protests. One, people are chanting off beat. It's like no rhythm. You be in the sun. There's nowhere to sit down. I'm really excited. I went to Abolition Park, and then prior to that, Occupy City Hall. I was like, thank God for the food justice movement, because at least now there's like food with seasoning. But there was like no thought about the human experience as a part of protesting. And I have to say, like, how there was that meeting of the minds between performance artists, activists, and academics. None of y'all got childcare. I mean, at least the tech people, they got like a little bit of childcare. And even then, it's like children are like this burden that women need to be relieved from so we could like meet our representation quota. And so the reason why I keep going back to that braiding example is that I don't So one is that my life is totally organized around what's most difficult, which in part is like the childcare situation. And then, I have some disabilities, they have some too. I've been really poor. So I've pretty much experienced this as a positive state change. One is I'm like a real non-academic academic, so nobody really cares if I publish anything. I have no measurable, largely people can't parse what I am and why I'm there. So they pretty much leave me, that's giving me like a lot of agency. And, if I don't like someone or their work or what they represent, I can alienate them with really no immediate impact or harm onto my life. Perhaps, we be imagining has met some diversity quota. I don't think anyone knows at Columbia, like exactly what we're doing. And we've had the privilege to be left alone. And so I really we didn't initially set out to do a podcast, but I did the podcast because I could do it like when my kids were sleeping or like in the weekend, like underneath my kid's bed. And I'm just like, to be honest with you, I'm in a point in my life where I'm pretty happy. In part, like due to white flight, rents really plummeted. And I used to sleep on the couch. So I used to say I would have horizontal time on the couch, and then I would have vertical productivity time on the couch. And now I got a whole room. I'm speaking to you from my 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom brownstone that's paying $2,000 less than the last people. So for us, individually, this has been experienced as like a positive state change. And I really just enjoy the podcast because it's a place for me. I don't know what the answer is. And that is why I feel like theory is really important. I realize how that, again, back to that murderous inclusion, capitalism commodify anything, like even abolition. Like I think that, they have no problem putting Fred Moulton's words on a tote bag and like selling it for $47 at the performance of it that includes impacted groups or something. But I really enjoy it because it's a chance for me to open up those questions. And then scrolling back, like who do I feel accountable to? Again, it's like all those groups that are not included in any of those like institutions. And so I don't watch a lot of TV, but I wanted something where I didn't have, I don't want like all the choosing, the doom scrolling. So I was like, ER, because there's like 15 seasons. And so I've recently binge watched that. And it just made me think about so many people who are featured in that who is excluded from all of this. The people with disabilities, the elderly, the intellectually disabled. And so I feel like there are people who are down a ride, like the people that I know that are right now, using illicit substances and have an addiction to opioids, for example, like they're down to ride. They're down to like tear this stuff up and set things on fire. They're not necessarily, I don't think, co-opted by the nonprofits as so much as that they don't see any reason to hope. And they know some activists, or they know some of these words, but I feel like if you really want people to get down with abolition, you got to get some people out of jail. You got to give something tangible and concrete. Like it can't be a metaphor. We have to really be about it, because for me, like, for example, I'm trying to think about this, how do I put this, but I have people in my life who have significant disabilities, and I know that I'm not calling the cops because, I don't need them to be dead. I need them to just, chill a little bit and de-escalate the situation. And there are 5,000 organizations and caseworkers and all these things, and none of them going to help. And so we got to figure it out on our own. And so many people who find themselves in that situation are going to be down and are down for abolition and for this movement. But who gonna watch these kids while they off attending a protest and yet another panel, And so when we're talking about organizing, like, what you mean, like, what is that? And, I think it has to be, we are inherently intergenerational. It's not like, I don't feel that everyone has to have a child or has to have a nuclear family, but all of us were born, all of us were brought into this world. And so we're all interdependent and we need each other. Like just how you said for your son, Kim, like if you said, people care and, things are going to get better, that kind of only has so much meaning, right? But the fact that people concretely showed that there was a community, that's what makes those words and those terms meaningful. So I'm just curious about like how you see this organizing for abolition. And then my really, really last thing, that I want to say about the podcast is that I'm really into music. I'm really like a big hip hop. It's been a hard year to be a hip hop head, but with the caveats, I really love hip hop, and podcast is interesting due to intellectual property regulations. You can't play licensed music on a podcast. And I do think there's like a unique problem between podcasts, which neither have a library or curation, right? Apple Podcast Library is just an algorithm. No one's curating it. Can't play licensed music, and SoundCloud. So you have all these unlicensed artists and musicians, and if some way that it'd be able to be brought together. We also have another project that we be imagining, Black Siren Radio, where you can play licensed music, but then you have to abide by FCC regulations. You can't curse, et cetera. There's some other words that we can't say. So that's interesting. And then the final part is that our end goal was never a podcast. It was about, there's this radical segregation among disciplines, activists, racially, right? How can you create a set of activity structures and social processes to bring these groups of people together and then co-create new public technological platforms? And like with this back and forth iteration between in real life and online, because I think it's not just about digital media organizing strategies, but like all of that only has meaning if there's some back and forth between in person and the digital.
I was going to ask if, because we've got 15 minutes, I know we've been taking a lot of time, so if you want to open it up for other folks to share.
So, interestingly enough, I don't think the chat has been was enabled. So I was getting text messages about that, and I'm not seeing Q&A on either. I'm not seeing questions, but at this time, I think if we could just kind of announce folks who are watching on the YouTube stream, if you have a question, please feel free to submit it on the YouTube stream, and we'll share it here. Or if you are on the Zoom, please submit your questions via the Q&A option here. So, I mean, and I also wanted to add, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you all, right? Like, because I think that one of the threads that I see in everybody's investment and engagement in this kind of project is both kind of like the exploration, like the exploratory stuff, right? Like the kind of tangible, but really like the humane aspect of all of this, right? Like, and I think that that's often what's missing in certain spaces, right? And so I think all of you all were fantastic and welcoming in kind of like, you know, like Khadijah said at the beginning, is the kind of like vulnerability, right? Like that there is kind of like a that vulnerability is a very human kind of experience, and for those of us, you know, expressing and coming into this kind of work, or being related to this work and the projects of both violence but also resistance, resilience, and kind of like imagining, right? Like, to use the term, right? We often like forget, right? Like, we get thought about as like robots and automatons, you know, and I think that if I was I mean, I am a student, right? Like, I'm learning from all of you all, right? But if I was a more formalized student, right, like a freshman and undergrad coming from South Central, listening to this would be like, oh, like, it's very invitational, you know? And I think that warmth is really something that is often, right? Because we're also angry, right? And frustrated and constantly like stressed, right? For a number of reasons. But it's warm and like, yeah, I mean, I think that I just wanted to highlight that for you all and just kind of mirror that back for you all, because I think that to me right now, like, it's a Friday, like, I'm about to go do some stuff right now, like, you know, in relation to this kind of work out in the street in Compton. And it's just like, this is the stuff that to me like keeps me going, right? So I deeply appreciate y'all's humanity in as a central force in the work that you all do, and the invitational aspect of all of it. So thank y'all so much.
Alex, and don't be mad at me, because you're going to be on the spot, and then I'm happy to answer also. I just want to acknowledge that Khadijah, like, in an intervention that was really nuanced, also lobbied us some real questions, right? So like, would you help us sort of answer that? Like, what do you mean by organizing? And because I know that you and I both do, I mean, there's like university stuff and like the Abolition School in this semi-autonomous aspirational space, but you're talking about the streets and the university, but what does it mean when you say organize or organizing?
So for me, it is this kind of, I'm an academic, right? Like in a reluctant way, right? Like I'm a first generation, like, working poor background with 2 immigrant / refugee parents, right, who came to this country. And I still live in the community that I'm from, right, like in South Central LA. And that has animated my space, the way that I like operate in the classroom. And so I work with predominantly students that are like me, that have the same kind of background, working poor. Oftentimes the students that'll gravitate towards me are formerly incarcerated or system impacted folks. And so part of, and I don't like to call it organizing, right? But it's like this holistic, like, advising presence that I try to be with and present with my students, right? Like, and kind of just mirror kind of their existence, right? And like affirm them in ways oftentimes that are never disconnected from my own experiences. So in some ways, right, like those students that I've been in the presence of have then taken the mantle, right, like, and advanced that, and also just blended that with their own experiences of organizing in this space, in this abolitionist space, right? Like I've been talking about abolition in the classroom since I got in the classroom, right? And in many ways, not formally, I mean, sometimes it was pretty formal, but really through talking story, the way that you all are doing, right? So in that sense, right, like it's part of my role there. In the network, right, like it's this speaker series trying to think about accessibility with our collaborators, right? And tapping into our you know, like there's an intimacy, right? Like tapping into our networks, right? And our humanity, right? Like I know Kim, right? Like I call Kim a dear friend, right? Like the first person that we spoke with was Dylan Rodriguez, who was on my committee, right? But like you know, I have a genuine kind of human relationship with this person, right? And then I have a colleague and some other folks, right? SA, I think's colleague and friend, right? Like dear friend / colleague right now, right? Like was part of that conversation. And I think that centering, not just inviting names, right, is something that has come up in our organizational space, right? Like, and just human beings that are doing this work and are committed in different ways, right? For our second event that we had, I invited the folks that are from the community, the communities and the community spaces that I organized with, to announce some of the actions that were happening, right? Like in our communities against police terror, right? And when I say our communities, I'm talking about like South Central, Compton, Watts, etc., right? On the other end, right? Like, what does it look like organizing? It is to extend the care and generosity and humanity, right? Like I was just telling Kim this right before the conversation. We had an action in a community that another homie of mine just told me that is akin to like somewhere like Brownsville in New York, right? I don't know what that means. I only know it through MOP, you know, and but that energy that MOP talked, you know, like I texted my homeboy yesterday. Sorry, this is the way that I talk. I texted my homeboy yesterday. It was like, I was like, so how did y'all not like just constantly do home invasions in the Bronx, like after listening to MOP? Like, I don't understand how you just not robbing and jacking fools all the time, you know, like, or like coming up on people's houses. So that was kind of the joke, right? And then so we got to talking about like space and geography and all of this stuff. And I was like, damn, that sounds like the community that we're organizing with right now for brother Fred Williams, who was killed by the LA Sheriff's Department, right? And so I was telling Kim about the first like kind of major action that we did, which was a march to the station, which this doesn't get as much acclaim as some of the bigger marches in the cities, right? Especially in LA. But I came with a box of Ferrero Rocher chocolates, right? I ain't from that hood. See, look, I see y'all smiling. Some of y'all know, right? Like what that means, especially for us that come from like refugee and immigrant backgrounds, right? Like this is like a real symbolic, and somebody wrote a blog about this somewhere that I remember, but like, I mean, I remember the intimacy with my own mother, right? Like through these chocolates. And here I was, this brown dude, right? Like with a mask, and, you know, like I'm not from that neighborhood, right? But I'm coming with the org from another neighborhood that's close, right? Like, and I have familiarity, and, you know, like how Khadijah said, right? Like, you know, Black vernacular English, right? Like in the way that the tones and intonation, like in our neighborhoods, like if you're from here, right? Like people recognize that you're from here, right? Like those cues that you're talking about, I got those, you know, because like I'm from here. Academia hasn't tainted it enough, thank goodness. But so there I am walking with this 48 pack of chocolates, and you know, I specifically was like, I want to give this to the elders, the kids, right, the mothers and the folks, right, like from that neighborhood. And I know who's from that neighborhood because you see the people that are coming from the outside to join the action. Then I'm walking around and people are just like, oh my God, and it just softens so much. Right, it just softens so much, and some of the folks that are there that are like criminalized folks, right, part of whatever stuff is going on in that neighborhood outside there, but are also dealing with the grief, right? Like it's that warmth of like, and then later I'm like that warmth and that kind of offering, right? Like, and we're also Maya Quiche, right? Like we're from Guatemala, and our people are indigenous, right? So like these kind of sacred offerings to folks, right? Like here's something, like thank you for letting us be here, you know, like without saying all that shit. but it's understood in our communities. And so I see one of the dudes, right, like who has tattoos on his face and shit, he's from that neighborhood. After, you know, he took the chocolate, and I'm like, how's that chocolate, bro? And he was like, yo, that shit was fire. And then, you know, like we just dap it up, and that was that. Right. But like it, like for those of us that are in these communities, right, or from these communities who are trying to build, right, like build these bridges and like systems of support and care, right, like we recognize that just that little expression, right, that to me is what organizing is, right, like building foundations of humanity, offering, you know, not just platitudes, right, but like actual like love and care and joy and just, you know, like I want you to recognize me because I see you, bro. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm here because I want to be here. I'm not doing fucking research on this shit. I'm not, you know, again, I'm an academic reluctantly, right? I'm at a teaching school. I want to invite the community members to come speak to my classes, right? Like, and as Hamid said earlier, right? Like, not to pimp, right? Like the stories, right? Like not to do that, but like so that students can see and find ways to support. And so the other part is, right, like inviting the students that are about this to come out to these actions and be part and learn, you know? So I hope that answers the question. Y'all got me nervous and shit, but so thank you for the question, Khadijah. I really appreciate it. And then the childcare stuff, we do that as well. Like I'm trying to get out of here so I could take my kid so we can all take care of each other's kids at this action that we're about to do in a little bit. So.
One quick point, and thank you, Alex. I really do appreciate that, because that brings back a whole sort of a quick scan of one's life as well. That I think it's also that how we, and this is a model that I have seen as an immigrant as well, which is such a Western kind of, like there's actual Olinsky model of organizing, this model of organizing, and I always thought like, man, why the fuck do you need this kind of like a blueprint for organizing? Because we were always organized. I mean, like, you know, I mean, in a sense of even from a childhood, that not to stick your finger in fire is trying to organize your thoughts and from there building up. So I think, and you gave the example of food, because for me, breaking bread is probably one of the finest and the best ways to build community and solidarity, and also like start those conversations as well. And it's in a sense, coming from a culture of storytelling and tale telling, you know, not to be limited, like, you know, okay, bullet points, do that. No, I mean, you know, coming from a culture where you spend 6 hours to get to a point that should take 5 minutes, but you need that because there are histories, and we can't diminish people's histories, our own histories. We can't delete button that. So anyways, sorry for taking that time. I said, I know we're going to be ending soon, but yeah, I just wanted to share that.
No, man, absolutely. Thank you so much for those reflections and like bringing it all together. I just want to be mindful of the time that you are all offering to this space. But actually what you said, Alex said, Kit, what we've been talking about definitely connects. There's not enough time, but Khadijah, will just keep talking, right? To speak on cam about the organizing question that I come to, but there was this thing that resonated as someone who is not from here, and I mean here in the obvious ways and the less obvious ones, but there is that immigrant connect in terms of like what we offer. And so for me, there is something that I bring from and I'm not an organizer. I specifically do not call myself that here in this place, but I was an organizer, like working in migrant and detention, like refugee spaces in the UK and in Europe. And that means a different set of things than it does mean for me here. But what I do here is, as a teacher, an educator, is do political education. So for me, the Abolition Open School is like right in my wheelhouse. It also goes, you know, if you are like me and think a lot about astrology, as a Virgo, I'm like very organizationally minded. And what I do like from my family and from the work, which was gender, that I had to do is be of service, right? To really know what it means to sort of, I am here and you are here. What can I offer you? How can we make it? This sort of energy that I was trained into in Jamaica, in Costa Rica, a family who are also indigenous, Garifuna there, in Central America. And so all those things I sort of think about and try to reconcile them and make sure that they're not in tension with my academic self, because then it's very clear for me that the academic self, quote unquote, is the first one to go, because my priorities and my stakes are not there. And so that is what I also try to communicate as an educator. All of those things too really connect with what we've been talking about, and I hope we continue to talk about too. And so the gendered aspect for me, like also like as a trans person, a non-binary person, thinking about gendered labor and what that has meant to mean in this like colonial sort of way, right? This like binary colonial sort of way, and then different to like the different perspectives that I'm hearing in terms of like Kim, Khadijah, like as women, like having to be aware in a certain set of way what care looks like and who gets coerced into or opts into doing it and what really choices there are. For me, being of service has looked like sort of intentionally like doubling down and say, I will offer this care or I will offer this domestic support. So I'm thinking Hamid was like near, you know, the 10-1 action that we had in front of UCPD, UCLA, when there was a translator, this indigenous Mexican woman translator who had 2 small children under the age of 2. One was maybe 7 months old and was like, I need help if I'm gonna translate between Spanish and English, like who's gonna hold the baby? And I was like, I absolutely will double down and hold your cute ass baby. That is like the least I can do in this space to sort of like show that it is not down to, you are offering, and translation is also a mode of care. Gage is also doing that for us right now with the ASL interpretation to sort of say, I want you to understand where I'm coming from and what I'm trying to communicate. I want you to know what it is that I mean so that we can mean something otherwise together. And so, yeah, these sort of modes of care that like the academy definitely isolates us sort of out of, it's helpful for me to know that those are not my stakes or commitments, and the literal least I can do besides offering that service, offering that care, is also to educate people into it, as I am also continually being educated into it. And so that's a little bit about my answer about not what organizing means to me, but what it looks like and what I can bring to organizers, or what I bring to a space of organization. It's like, you know, into organizing us into what? And for me, the question there is certainly like one of like freedom and liberation, which are not always the same words, abolition and revolution, which are absolutely not the same words, but in sometimes academic spaces get used as like a one-to-one. And that is for sure something that I'm not going to say on camera, because revolution and the maybe violence that it requires in the Fanonian sense is not one that we can sort of chastely chat about on a panel, like, right? But anyway, maybe let's shout out to everyone. I want to just end with or close from this moderation, and shout out to the homie Alex for co-moderating with me. Gage, I did not thank you at the start, but we can all thank Gage for carrying us through this conversation. Usually interpreters are like tag team. We may have seen all these Zooms that everybody is on, and Gage has really just carried us from start to finish, not dropping a beat, and it's been really incredible. We are hoping to build up the Abolition Open School, right? This not just as a series, also answering Khadijah's question, but also like a sustained conversation that we build and develop. There's going to be more that we say next time, but I wanted to offer a couple of things. One, we hope to be second Fridays of the month. Life happens, as we heard on cam from everyone's talks, right? So things may shift, but the aim is that from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern, just kidding, Pacific. I looked at y'all and I tried to do the math, it didn't work out. But 11:30 a.m. thanks to 1 p.m. Pacific. I'll just leave it there.
2:30 to
who's out here doing maths? That's not that time of day. That's not that time of day. +3 for the Eastern zones, okay? But, you know, shout out to my aunties 8 hours away who were on the call earlier and gave me a little panic attack. The next one is going to be, and it's a series, second Fridays, but the next one we aim to be, it relates directly to what we've been talking about here. If this one was called How We Spread the Message, that one on December 11th will be How We Nourish Each Other. And so there we want to bring in folks who specifically talk about what others we've brought in, not just care work, but specifically related to food justice, food sovereignty, mutual aid support. Or we're going to bring in other folks from community to sort of think with us about these things. And so that it's not just, you know, a one-off cute little webinar and we're all doing so many of those, we really want to build. So what we're going to do, the framing is going to shift a bit each time. The moderators will be different, the players will be different, same time though, is the aim. where folks will talk a little bit about, sort of be asked to reflect on some of the interventions that folks brought in here and say, how do we bring that into what y'all are doing? Or how do you reflect on some of these same questions? And then the specific theme will be one of how we nourish each other, however folks will take that up next month, and then we'll find out. So that's another thing with organizing, right? Which is what I'm hearing too from Brian, Kim, Hamid, Khadijah. There's what Alex called the intimacy, the way that people are connected to one another. Like that's how Kim came to this work, right? How Kim's children are able to be supported on the inside, but really to say how we're like building and not just like, what can I consume and then let it go. So in addition to these like once a month intentional like collabos moments where we're building in this Zoom space, what folks from the UCLA Divest Invest Faculty Collective, Shanna Redmond, and folks in community, BLM folks in LA are thinking about is doing like a local chapter in LA. And so please reach out to us if you are interested in hearing more about that, either in LA, but definitely in other spaces in California, whether or not you're affiliated with the CSUs or UCs, because what we want is, if this is the theme, how we spread the message, take it up. Right? Talk about it on social media to one another in your houses. Let's think through, like, tell us what you're reading that connects to like spreading the message, sharing your knowledge, poems, songs, whatever it is, right? And then thinking with us with these themes and building with the next month's themes and the next, so that we're also not just doing that one-on-one tip, right? We're like deepening our knowledge, deepening our capacity to work together and to know what we mean when we say abolition, to know what we mean, Khadijah, when we say organize. And I'm just like really hyped for that to be like the growing project. The more people that come onto it, the more we can like get informed and do this work, strategize our way to that freedom. So I think that's it. We're a little bit over time. Thank you all. Thank you, Kim Wilson and Brian Sonenstein, who are at beyond_prison. Khadijah Abdurahman, who's, I'm going to say the radio show, but it's like at We Be Imagining, is that right? But your personal handle is like Up From the Cracks. Is that right? Yeah, memory. Hamid, I don't know your personal handle, but you're at StopLAPD Spying on Twitter. I am at ESSAYSMYTHE. On Twitter, Alex at CSU_LAS. So that's us. Feel free to reach out, connect, continue the conversation in those spaces, and then stay tuned for the Abolition Open School to come.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you
So much.
Yeah.